We come to the urgent question. Andy McDonald.
To ask the Foreign Secretary to make a statement on the situation in Gaza and Lebanon.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for raising this important question. We are deeply concerned about the continuing violence. We must avoid this conflict spiralling further out of control and into a wider regional war, which is in no one's interest. The UK was the first G7 nation to call for an immediate ceasefire between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel, and for the implementation of a political plan that will enable civilians on both sides to return to their homes. The Prime Minister has spoken with international leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, King Abdullah of Jordan, President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, to press the case for a ceasefire. This builds on extensive discussions by the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister at the UN with regional leaders. We were gravely concerned to hear that 5 UN peacekeepers have been injured by the Israeli Defence Forces. We reiterate that attacks on UN peacekeepers and UN members of staff are unacceptable. All parties must take all necessary measures to protect all UN personnel and premises and allow the UN to fulfil its mandate. The UK co-signed a joint statement by 34 UNIFIL contributing countries condemning recent attacks, calling for such actions to stop immediately and be adequately investigated. The situation in Lebanon, Mr Speaker, is worsening by the day. Civilian casualties are mounting and more than a quarter of the Lebanese population has been displaced. On the subject of humanitarian needs in Lebanon, I announced £10 million of support to Lebanon to respond to the widespread lack of shelter and reduced access to water, hygiene and healthcare. This is in addition to the £5 million we've already provided to UNICEF. It's clear that a political solution, consistent with Resolution 1701, is the only way to restore the sovereignty, territorial integrity and stability of Lebanon. This requires an immediate ceasefire between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel now, and immediate negotiations to re-establish security and stability for the people living on either side of the Israeli-Lebanon border. Now, while the world turns its attention to Lebanon, we must not forget the situation for the people of Gaza. They are in a truly intolerable situation currently, and winter will make them increasingly vulnerable, including to communicable disease. All of Gaza's population now faces the risk of famine. Access to basic services, safe drinking water, shelter, healthcare is becoming harder by the day. We are gravely concerned by the situation in northern Gaza in particular. Very little aid has entered northern Gaza since the 1st of October. Evacuation orders continue to be issued across northern Gaza, but civilians are struggling to move to safety. And we are worried that the IDF-designated humanitarian zone is overcrowded and unsafe. Israel must comply with international humanitarian law and allow unfettered aid access. The message from this government is clear. Israel could and must do more to ensure that aid reaches civilians in Gaza. It is unacceptable to restrict aid. We have not lost sight of the destabilising role of Iran across the Middle East through their support to militias, including Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis. Iran must immediately halt its attacks on Israel. To that end, we have placed a number of sanctions designations, and I welcome the rest of the questions. Thank you.
Can I do say it is 3 minutes? Please, can we try and stick to that? Right, Andy McDonald is going to be a fine example of 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister. As Israel cuts off northern Gaza from essential supplies, it continues to strike Palestinian civilians whilst demanding their displacement. But the attacks such as those on Al-Aqsa Hospital in central Gaza on Sunday night show there is nowhere safe to go. The sight of a patient on an IV drip burning to death in the flames of an airstrike on the tents of refugees will be the abiding image of this genocide. So the 400,000 or so civilians left without food or supplies in northern Gaza are increasingly subject to airstrike, artillery and small arms fire from Israeli forces. 11,500 children killed in Gaza in a year. That's one classroom full of children every day for a single year. And in Lebanon we see Israeli strikes killing civilians, but now we hear, in addition to invading UNIFIL posts, there are reports of attacks of UNIFIL forces of a chemical nature. As to UNIFIL, I acknowledge the Foreign Secretary's call to Israel and all parties to uphold their obligations, but repeatedly calling on Israel to uphold their obligations has no impact. Unless forced to change, Israel will continue to commit further outrages and breaches of international law in the Lebanon, in West Bank, and its starvation and targeting of civilians in Gaza. And even Lord Cameron has today talked about individual sanctions for far-right Israeli ministers. Will the Foreign Secretary consider those and other measures? A partial arms embargo has not stopped the attacks on civilians either. Surely that has to be extended. The government told me in a written answer that the US government manages the sale of F-35 aircraft to Israel and the F-35 global supply chain. So in the interest of protecting civilians in Gaza, I ask the government to open discussion with the US to remove Israel from the end-use destinations of the F-35 global supply chain. There are many partners for peace in the region whose efforts are rejected by Israel, but the UK has an important role to play. So given recognition of Palestine is a prerequisite for peace and not a byproduct of it, is it not now time to join the global majority in doing so?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the number of important points that he made. First of all, he referred to footage which has been circulating widely, and this is one of many instances of very disturbing footage that many of us will have seen and many of our constituents as well. Of course, the government looks very closely at all of those reports. We are concerned by all reports, and we will continue to take very seriously our responsibilities when it comes to conducting IHL assessments in that case, or indeed in relation to any other such case. My honourable friend also mentioned the UK government's position in relation to UNIFIL. Actually, the UK government could not have been clearer on this. We were appalled to hear that UN peacekeepers had been injured by Israeli fire, and alongside international allies and partners, we condemn the attacks on UN peacekeepers. I think that is crystal clear. I would say that to my honourable friend. My honourable friend also referred to the issue of Palestinian statehood and recognition. The UK is working with partners to support a path to long-term peace and stability with a two-state solution at its heart. That means a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. And we want to be clear, Palestinian statehood is the right of the Palestinian people. It is not in the gift of any neighbour, and it's also essential to the long-term security of Israel. Thank you.
Shadow Minister Harriett Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Palestinians face a devastating humanitarian crisis. The UK must continue to play a leading role in alleviating that suffering. There are still hostages in Gaza, including the British citizen Emily Damari. Can the Minister update the House on efforts to secure her release and the release of other hostages who are in such awful jeopardy? The previous government trebled our Gaza aid commitment and facilitated aid flows by land, sea and air. Can the Minister confirm that those efforts continue? Can the Minister give us an update on the implementation of the Colonna recommendations on UNRWA? Turning to Lebanon, British nationals are urged to follow the UK travel advice. Clearly, Resolution 1701 has not been implemented. Hezbollah has mobilised south of the Litani River and fired thousands of rockets into northern Israel. What steps is the government taking with the UN to secure implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 and get Hezbollah to pull back? Just as aid workers are not a target, UN peacekeepers cannot be a target. Does the Minister agree with Israel's assessment that Hezbollah has built thousands of tunnel shafts next to the Chapter 6 UNIFIL peacekeepers? Has this put their mission in such grave danger that the UN must now review its mandate? This is a grave situation. There is no equivalence between Iran's terrorist proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, and the State of Israel. Israel has a right to defend itself against an existential threat, but too many innocent civilians are seeing their lives lost and their lives irreparably changed. The UK must continue to support them with humanitarian aid.
Minister.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the honourable member for the many important points that she has made. First of all, she commented on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and clearly we see currently a truly desperate an appalling situation for many people in Gaza. Over 90% of the population now have been displaced. Many people have been displaced numerous times, some even 10 times being forced to move. And as I mentioned in my remarks, all of Gaza's population now faces the risk of famine, as well as many other challenges around water, sanitation, spread of communicable disease, and of course winter, as I said, is approaching. This really is a very concerning time. Now, she talked about the situation in relation to hostages. I can confirm to her that the Foreign Secretary has met with or spoken to all families of UK and UK-linked hostages cruelly detained by Hamas, and he has heard firsthand the suffering those families have endured. The Prime Minister has also met with the families of UK hostages in London on the 11th and 14th of September. He's also hosted them as well at number 10, and we continue to raise the cases of our UK and UK-linked hostages at every single opportunity. She talked about the need to ensure that aid is reaching Gaza, that the UK plays its part. That's a responsibility this government takes very seriously indeed. I was concerned to ensure that as the new Development Minister, I made sure that I saw the delivery of the aid the new UK government has committed to. That included visiting Jordan so that I could see the situation on the ground for myself. Clearly, however, it's got more challenging since then. Nonetheless, we will continue to work to ensure much needed aid is being received. That's included, for example, an announcement of additional support to UK Med as well as to UNICEF as well, and a joint UK and Kuwait approach to funding to help UNICEF to deliver life-saving aid to almost 2.5 million people in Gaza and in Yemen as well. She talks about the situation in Lebanon. The UK government's position on this is clear. Any UK citizens must leave Lebanon immediately. There's clear advice about this now available. It has been for some time on the SEDO website. And then finally, she talked about Resolution 1701 in relation to Lebanon. We are very clear that a political solution consistent with Resolution 1701 is the only way to restore the sovereignty, territorial integrity and stability of Lebanon, and to restore security and stability for the people living on either side of the Israeli-Lebanon border. We will continue to support it and to advocate for it.
Foreign Affairs, Emily Thornberry.
My right honourable friend speaks with great eloquency about how completely wrong it is for UN peacekeepers to be attacked in the way that they have been. They put their bodies in the line, keeping warring parties apart, and have been able to maintain peace, rough peace, on the blue line for nearly 18 years before this conflict began. But may I ask, is it possible for us to go further than just to condemn it? Given that there are 10,000 peacekeepers for UNIFIL from 50 countries, the full complement ought to be 15,000. Italy provides 1,000, France and Spain over 600, Ireland nearly 400, Germany over 100, whilst we provide one. I wonder if it might be possible for the government to reconsider the number of peacekeepers that are sent to UNIFIL and whether Britain could make a bit bigger contribution.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to welcome my honourable friend to her rightful place as Chair of the Select Committee on Foreign Affairs. She is right that the role of UNIFIL is absolutely crucial. It already was incredibly important, of course, in southern Lebanon, but it's now even more important given the escalating situation that we see in the region, and the UK fully supports UNIFIL's work. Of course, we keep our support for all UN agencies continuously under review. That applies to UNIFIL as well. And I just realised that I failed to respond to the question around the Kelowna report, in relation to another UN agency, UNRWA. Just to be clear that the UK has engaged substantively on the recommendations from the Kelowna report. I've done it myself, both with General Lazzarini and with his deputy as well. And we're continuing to work on this, and that's included financial support towards implementing the Kelowna report.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Calum.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. No one can be left unmoved by the level of human suffering we have seen recently on our screens. We need immediate ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon more than ever. In Lebanon, Liberal Democrats were appalled to learn of the unjustifiable attacks on UN peacekeepers by the IDF. Israel must stop these attacks and comply with international humanitarian law. The mass displacement orders issued by the IDF to 400,000 Palestinians in northern Gaza and the ongoing bombings place the population at grave risk. The international community must press for their protection. Will the Minister commit to increasing the supply of aid to the region? The UK aid to Lebanon has been cut by 90% since 2019. Does the Minister agree that now is the time to use our sanctions regime against the extremist ministers Ben Gvir and Smotrich? And following the government's new sanctions on Iran announced yesterday, will the government go further and now prescribe the IRGC?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the honourable member for raising these very important matters. We're of the same mind when it comes to that condemnation, obviously, of attacks on UNIFIL, as I set out a few moments ago, but also in terms of concern about the humanitarian situation, both in Gaza and in Lebanon as well. And I discussed that in detail with the Lebanese ambassador to the UK, the need to ensure that there was both pre-positioned aid but then support, particularly for children. And I'm sure many members in this House will be aware that those who've been displaced in Lebanon, a number of them have been placed into, understandably, public schools, but of course that then means that the children are unable to learn, as well as the impact on those displaced. Hence, we have ensured that we have provided additional support as a new government. I set that out in my remarks at the beginning. We believe that's very important to have that additional support. He also talked about those who have expressed views which are inflammatory or even worse than that, remarks which are appallingly discriminatory. The UK government has been wholehearted in its condemnation of those remarks. He asked about sanctions specifically. Of course, the UK will always keep our sanctions regime closely under review, as he would expect, and will announce any changes to the House. Thank you.
The International Development Committee, Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It feels a pathetic understatement to say the situation in Gaza, particularly northern Gaza, grows ever more desperate and urgent, particularly as I've been saying it for a year. I apologise, Mr. Speaker. But the UN says it's not been allowed to deliver essential supplies, including food, since October. Mr. Speaker, last week, 15 UK and Irish humanitarian organisations warned the UK is failing to uphold international law, and without bold and immediate action from the UK, Palestinians in northern Gaza are facing an imminent existential threat. Please, Minister, give us more details on exactly what this government is doing to make sure the retired general's surrender or starve strategy isn't being implemented. We need to do more than just debate in this chamber.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for her remarks, and again I would want to congratulate her for her leadership of the Select Committee on Development. I think this government has shown that we absolutely are determined to play our part with UK leadership on these issues, which are of such desperate concern to our constituents and, of course, to the whole world. That has meant there's been serious engagement at every level, including within the first days of the new government coming into office, engagement at the highest level from the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, myself, right across government with our counterparts, whether those be the Palestinian Authority, the Lebanese government, of course, also the Israeli government, other regional actors, the US more broadly. We are determined to ensure that the ceasefires that are so desperately needed are put into place, and that we play our part in facing up to the humanitarian crisis that we see unfolding.
Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, even if you care little for the tens of thousands of dead Arabs and the millions displaced, even if you couldn't give a damn for the children shot in the head or the burning hospital inmates in northern Gaza, if your only concern is the security of Israel, can the Minister see any argument to say that yet another massacre of Gazans will enhance that security in the future? And if she can't see any way that it can, when is the government going to stop wringing its hands about this conflict and actually take positive, active steps to enforce international law and bring about a ceasefire?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't disagree more with his characterisation of the UK government's approach. I just mentioned a few moments ago the engagement that has taken place, but in addition, I want to be crystal clear. The new UK government has always supported international humanitarian law. That is why we have been absolutely clear from the first moment of entering office that we support the mandate of the International Criminal Court. We support the International Court of Justice. We ensured that we reviewed arms export licences as well, something that the previous government had not done, because we believe that was a legal imperative, and we will continue to take action to show that UK leadership which the UK population and those globally are looking to our country to deliver.
Can I just say there's a lot of people standing. This is going to run to about 1:50. So short questions, short answers. We'll hopefully get everybody in. A good example, Nazshah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, has said Israel has perpetrated a concerted policy to destroy Gaza's healthcare system as part of a broader assault on Gaza, committing war crimes and the crime against humanity of extermination, which with relentless and deliberate attacks on medical personnel and facilities. The United Nations does not make these claims lightly. And so can I ask the Minister whether these assessments have also been made by our government's legal teams, and in light of this, what further actions have been taken to protect international law, life itself in Gaza, and human rights?
Not quite the example. Minister.
First of all, she mentions the critically important issue of healthcare in Gaza. That has been of considerable concern to the UK government. That's why we announced £5.5 million worth of new medical aid to UK Med for operating their field hospitals in Gaza. I met personally with UK Med to understand more about their response to ensure that we were playing our part. It's also why we've supported UNICEF as well around supporting vulnerable families in Gaza with water, healthcare and specialist treatment. And of course, when it comes to international humanitarian law, we take that responsibility very seriously to ensure that we are conducting the assessments that are needed legally.
Leila Moran.
Mohammed is a consultant NHS surgeon. In fact, he was mine when I was in hospital with sepsis just a few months ago. His parents are in Jabalia refugee camp. They are elderly. His father has no colon. His mother has diabetes. They cannot move. There is nowhere safe for them to move. And yet, if they tried to move, he tells me that everything is being shot by drones and that there are bodies strewn in the street. Will the Minister impress upon the Israeli government that Mohammed's parents, the sick, the elderly, and those who have stayed to care for them, are not legitimate targets of war, no matter how many times they might have been told to move? And furthermore, if arrest warrants are issued for Netanyahu, as has been trailed, will this government support it?
Can I just say this is a very important issue. I really do want to get everybody in, but you're going to have to help each other, and I don't want people to miss out. So please, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're very much aware that now over 85% of Gaza is under evacuation orders. That's causing chronic overcrowding, with people desperately seeking shelter. And last month, the number of humanitarian trucks that entered Gaza was actually the lowest we've seen since the start of the year. So she asked about our message to Israel and the representations that we've made. We call on Israel to take all possible steps to avoid civilian casualties, to allow unfettered aid into Gaza through all land routes, to respect the mandate of the UN, and to provide the UN and its humanitarian partners the ability to operate effectively. And that is particularly in relation to the most vulnerable, as she rightly mentioned.
Richard Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last few days alone, Israel has burned people alive by bombing a tent camp at a hospital, killed children after bombing a school, and fired on UN peacekeepers. We've had a year of this. As a Palestinian lawyer told me, Britain knows exactly what to do because it rightly did it against Russia after its illegal invasion of Ukraine, imposed sanctions. Sanctions on arms, sanctions on trade, sanctions on officials. That's how to get Israel to stop doing what it's doing. So when will Israel be held to the same standards for its war crimes and violations of international law?
It is indeed very important that the UK takes its responsibilities seriously. He talked about some of the reports that we have seen. Of course, the UK government is looking very closely at those reports and really determined to ensure that we play our part in ensuring that international law is upheld. He talked about sanctions policy. As I mentioned before, we will always keep that under review, but he should be aware that the UK has, for example, already sanctioned 8 people responsible for perpetrating and inciting human rights abuses. That was against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. We will continue to keep these issues under review.
Does bombing a hospital and having patients on IV drips burned to death in their beds constitute a war crime?
As I mentioned previously, the UK government is looking very carefully at all reports. There has, of course, been considerable footage that is extremely disturbing, not just the footage that many of us have seen, to which he refers, but of other types as well. Of course, it's very important that the UK government looks at this carefully, makes proper assessments. There is a legal regime for doing this, and this UK government takes those legal responsibilities seriously because we know the impact that they can have.
Tim Rocker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the government agree with me that we urgently need a ceasefire in both the Lebanon and Gaza, but also with the grotesque level of civilian deaths, we need to see international law observed and breaches of it investigated properly?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for making that point, and I will underline again, the UK government wants to see an immediate ceasefire. Also, the release of all hostages still cruelly detained by Hamas and much more aid entering Gaza. The death and destruction in Gaza is intolerable, and the UK government was the first government in the G7 to call for a ceasefire in relation to the situation in Lebanon. We do believe it's critically important as well that international humanitarian law is upheld. We take that responsibility very seriously.
Sir Alex Shelby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60,000 people were displaced in northern Israel. That has led to the attacks in Lebanon targeting Hezbollah. So may I ask the Honourable Lady, when Israel does respond to Iran's attack, are we going to be saying that it's Israel who should cease fire? And if so, why are we not talking to further regional partners to de-escalate from Iran's provocation in Gaza, in Lebanon and directly?
Minister.
That engagement is taking place continuously with the new government, with countries within the region but also beyond it. We view our responsibility to be a voice for de-escalation, an active partner pushing for that de-escalation very seriously indeed.
Kat Smith.
The humanitarian situation in northern Gaza, as the Minister has outlined, is so dire now that unconventional means of getting aid into northern Gaza might need to be considered. Can I ask the Minister what conversations she's having with colleagues about airdropping aid into northern Gaza to aid the humanitarian situation there?
Minister. No, I totally agree with
So my honourable friend raises an important issue, and I discussed these matters in detail when I was in Jordan, but also with a number of humanitarian organisations that are active on the ground, and of course with UNRWA as well when I've had meetings with them. There are challenges, of course, around delivering aid through, for example, airdrops. It's not as well targeted. It can cause additional problems. It really is important that land routes, which are the most effective way of getting aid into Gaza, that they are enabled. We need to see more trucks getting into Gaza, more access for people to get that aid, and it is unacceptable where there are restrictions on aid.
Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, all of us recognise the horrendous scale of the civilian casualties in the region. Would the Minister agree with me that what the Government needs to do is to try and unite international opinion in getting the remaining hostages released and dealing with the terrorist threat of those who want to annihilate all Israelis?
Well done.
Minister.
The Government has been seeking precisely to work globally and with countries in the region to de-escalate, to ensure that civilians are protected. And absolutely, this UK government recognises Israel has the right to defend itself, but we must see a future where ultimately we have a two-state solution, and most immediately we must see a ceasefire both in Gaza and in Lebanon as well.
Marshall Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the situation in Gaza is beyond devastating, there have been over 1,400 settler attacks in the West Bank. The Minister says she's keeping sanctions under review. I ask her, what is it going to take to impose sanctions on those settlers, but also the settler organisations that are funding these settlers to carry out these atrocious attacks?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this issue, but the UK Government's position could not be clearer here. Settlements are illegal under international law. They present an obstacle to peace and they threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution. And during his visit in July, the Foreign Secretary met with Palestinians displaced in the West Bank. He was horrified to hear of the acts of violence that have been carried out by settlers. And the UK Government has strongly condemned settler violence and insightful remarks, as we talked about before. And we urge Israel to take greater action to hold violent settlers to account and clamp down on those who seek to inflame tensions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United Nations interim force in Lebanon has failed to prevent Hezbollah's rearmament in southern Lebanon since 2006, sitting idly by whilst they amassed 150,000 missiles with support from Iran. These missiles are now being used on Israeli communities, with UNIFIL and Lebanese civilians being used as human shields by the terror group. So what discussions has the Minister had with her Israeli counterparts to counter this threat?
Minister.
Well, he talked about the approach of Hezbollah. The United Kingdom Government has been absolutely resolute in condemning Hezbollah's attacks on Israel over the last 11 months, which have driven more than 60,000 people from their homes. These unjustified attacks have brought misery to ordinary people in Lebanon and in Israel, and we have repeatedly urged Lebanese Hezbollah to engage with the US-led discussions to resolve their disagreements diplomatically. We have made those points to every country in the region that he would expect.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let us be absolutely clear in this House. The seriousness of Israel's violations of international law, as evidenced by countless international organisations, could not be more obvious. But the total lack of accountability has led to the international rules-based order collapsing around us as we watch children starve and teenagers burn to death in Israeli airstrikes into hospital compounds. The international community must now end the empty words. We need concrete steps, Minister. So will the Minister today immediately announce an end to the arms sales and immediately announce applying sanctions for the war crimes and breaches of international law?
Mr. Speaker, the UK Government has been absolutely clear. Israel must act in accordance with international humanitarian law and must take all possible steps to avoid civilian casualties. We continue to urge Israel to fulfil its promise to flood Gaza with aid, and we urge Israel to permit immediate and unfettered access for the International Committee of the Red Cross to detention centres as well. The Foreign Secretary and other ministers will continue to raise these issues with the Israeli government, and my honourable friend must surely be aware that following a review of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law in respect to its activity in Gaza, the government suspended around 30 export licences to Israel.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all want the killings to stop. We abhor the deaths. We all want a ceasefire as soon as possible. But clearly, the fastest way to a ceasefire is for Hamas to return the hostages and for Hamas and Hezbollah to stop attacking Israel with missiles. That is the fastest way to a ceasefire, and the Western nations have failed to convince these proscribed terror organisations that this House appears to have forgotten about from these attacks. And therefore, what Israel has concluded is the fastest way to defend itself and to ensure the safety of the region is to destroy Hamas and to destroy Hezbollah.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say I don't agree with this characterisation of certainly the leadership from the UK Government on these issues. The UK Government has been absolutely clear. We must see an immediate ceasefire. We must see the release of all hostages, of a flood of aid into Gaza, and ultimately the two-state solution that the people of Israel and Palestinians so rightly deserve.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, the situation in Gaza goes way beyond Israel's right to defend itself.
The restriction on aid going into Gaza is just unacceptable. And words just have not shifted Israel's position one iota. So isn't it time that the government recognised that we need to go beyond words and to start talking to our international allies and how we can force Israel to allow aid into Gaza and to get both sides to call a ceasefire?
Minister. I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have gone well beyond words. Of course, now clearly diplomacy here around the humanitarian situation is very important, but we've also been determined to ensure that the UK plays its part in getting that much needed aid in as quickly as possible. And the UK continues to provide core relief items. It's already provided 78,000 shelter items, 76,000 wound care kits and 1.3 million items of medicine that have been desperately needed.
Simon Hall.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I agree with my right honourable friend for North West Hampshire. Tehran will not let Hamas and Hezbollah stop, and the lunatic right who are propping up Netanyahu will not let him sue for peace either. So the Western powers and everybody else can have as many conversations and urgings as they wish. Those have been going on for months. They are delivering precious little benefit, apart from more blood, heartache and tears on all sides. I know it's a difficult thing for a minister to deal with at the dispatch box, but at some point Washington, London and others surely have to realise that their current diplomatic strategy is not working and something else needs to be tried. Otherwise, we will be standing here for months to come, wringing our hands continually, expressing support or condemnation or solidarity or whatever, and all we will see are the bodies of the dead piling up on both sides.
Minister. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In actual fact, the UK Government has been very clear in our condemnation of Iran's role in this situation. We have condemned in the strongest terms Iran's attack against Israel. We have been clear that it escalated an incredibly dangerous situation. It has pushed the region even closer to the brink. It cannot be tolerated. And the Foreign Secretary has taken this up directly with the Iranian First Minister. He's condemned Iran's attack on Israel and was clear that Iran must take immediate steps to de-escalate the situation to prevent further death in the Middle East.
Jacob Collier.
Madam Deputy Speaker, does the Minister agree with me that the rejection of a two-state solution is against the interests of both Israelis and Palestinians, and that we need a path towards a sustainable and long-term lasting peace?
Minister.
I absolutely do, and that has been the long-standing position of this government, both in opposition and now in office. We really do need to see that two-state solution. It can no longer be just words. It must become a reality, and we will do all we can to get to a situation where that right of Palestinians, of Israelis, is realised.
Andrew Murison.
Deliberate targeting of UN peacekeepers is always unacceptable. But given the evident failure of UN Resolution 1701 and UNIFIL in intent and mission, what does the Minister suggest Israel is to do when it's facing incessant attacks on its population by a terrorist organisation backed by a state? Is it to tolerate the building of tunnels and attack positions in territory south of the Litani River indefinitely?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the government's view is that UNIFIL's role in southern Lebanon is crucial. It is absolutely critical given the escalating situation in the region, but it was incredibly important before as well, crucial in southern Lebanon, around protecting people there. And the UK fully supports UNIFIL's work, as mandated, of course, in UN Security Resolution 1701. That's a very firm basis for its operation, and we back that basis wholeheartedly.
Apsana Begum.
The Minister has mentioned international law many times in her statement. My constituents are appalled at the inconsistency in the way in which international law and human rights are applied depending on who is committing the atrocity and who makes up the targeted civilian population. So will this government finally do the right thing, end all arms sales to Israel, and will she express a simple condemnation of the actions of Israel, including the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure?
Minister.
The UK Government is absolutely clear about the fundamental importance of the international rule of humanitarian law, and that it must apply without fear or favour, whoever we are talking about, wherever in the world they are. The UK respects the jurisdiction and independence of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, and she can see that commitment to the rule of law reflected in many decisions the new government has made, of course including the review of Israel's compliance with IHL in respect of its activity in Gaza, which led to the suspension of around 30 export licences to Israel.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister quite rightly acknowledges the abominable situation faced by people in Gaza and in southern Lebanon at the present time. The fundamental question asked by the member for Middlesbrough was simply this: if we condemn the acts that have been undertaken by the Israeli Defence Force, the killing of civilians, the killing of people in hospitals and schools, then why are we still supplying the weapons to Israel which enables them to undertake these military activities?
Minister.
Well, the UK Government has been absolutely clear in the repeated messages that we have conveyed to Israeli counterparts to take all possible steps to avoid civilian casualties, to allow unfettered aid into Gaza through all land routes, and to provide the UN and its humanitarian partners the ability to operate effectively. We've also been very clear, as I've said many times during this statement, around attacks on UNIFIL. He is well aware, I believe, of the decisions taken by the UK Government in respect of the arms export regime, and I will not go over that again because we have debated that already in this House.
Paul Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UN Commission of Inquiry found last week that Israeli security forces, and I quote, deliberately killed, detained and tortured medical personnel and targeted medical vehicles while tightening their siege on Gaza. These actions constitute war crimes. Can the Secretary of State tell me how the UK Government will hold Israel to account for such appalling conduct?
Minister.
The UK Government looks very carefully indeed at any reports suggesting that there has been the breaking of international humanitarian law. We have been particularly concerned about the situation for many healthcare workers. We've seen a large number of those healthcare workers being killed. Also, that has included, of course, UK and UK-linked personnel as well. And we continue to look at all of these representations carefully, including those which have come from the UN.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The current 1701 Security Council resolution that the Minister supported a moment ago is established under UN Chapter 6 of the under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. This is for peacekeeping, and the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee said earlier that we could potentially deploy British troops into the situation to supplement UNIFIL. Would the Minister ensure that there are no British troops deployed into that situation until there is a peace to keep, or under a UN Chapter 7 of the Charter, which would be peace enforcement?
Minister.
Well, the UK Government has been very clear that it is through diplomatic channels and also through our humanitarian effort that we are seeking to do all that we can to promote de-escalation. Any decisions in relation to any resolution would of course be taken very seriously indeed by our Defence Secretary, by the whole of government, but it has been through those humanitarian and diplomatic levers that we have been straining every sinew to de-escalate, to improve the situation of those populations who are so badly impacted at the moment.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think it's fair to say that calling on the Israeli government to change action has not and will not work. We now see a situation where there are currently 3 bills in the Israeli Knesset to outlaw UNRWA. And we had the Foreign Secretary state in this House that UNRWA is no other agency can deliver aid on the scale needed. Will the Secretary of State show political leadership and UK leadership and show explicit support for UNRWA?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, because we have a number of times that has been a personal priority for me. Soon after coming into office as Minister for Development, I ensured that I met with General Lazzarini. I've also met with his deputy as well when I was in Jordan, and we were very clear at the UN General Assembly that we support the mandate of UNRWA. Its role is incredibly important. The Colonna Review was important for that organisation. The UK Government has supported UNRWA in implementing it, and we are very clear that it is a critical organisation, not just in Gaza, but in fact in the wider region as well.
Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The far-right Netanyahu government continues to assert that it's complying with international law when it's clear that it's acting without restraint from the atrocities in northern Gaza, Israeli settlement in the West Bank, completely inadequate evacuation orders to suburbs, densely populated suburbs in Beirut. Will the Minister recognise that the UK is complicit in these war crimes due to the UK government's continued refusal to stop all arms sales to Israel?
Minister.
I regret the honourable member's phrasing, because actually I believe the UK government has done exactly what it needed to do. Legally and constitutionally, that was to ensure there was that proper review, operating with international humanitarian law's requirements being taken seriously. That led to that decision to suspend 30 arms licences. That shows a government taking those responsibilities seriously, and that is what we will continue to do.
Abdesam Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UN confirms it has not been able to deliver food aid in northern Gaza since the 1st of October. That's almost 2 weeks of no food, no water and no aid going to the north of Gaza. We now hear reports that Netanyahu plans a surrender or starve plan, which if carried out will leave hundreds of thousands of Palestinians without the essentials. International humanitarian law prohibits the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Does the Minister agree that, and share my view, that this is totally inexcusable and that Israel must stop using starvation as a weapon of war? And will she provide an update on the efforts that we will take to ensure that this doesn't continue and that we will not sit by and watch Palestinians starve to death?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her question. The UK government has been absolutely clear about our concern about the situation for very large numbers of people in extreme need in northern Gaza. The fact that the entire population of Gaza now is at risk of starvation, but a particularly intense situation for those in northern Gaza. She's right about the fact that, disturbingly, it appears there has not been that access since the 1st of October. There should have been. We have been clear. Israel must stand by its commitment to flood aid with Gaza. We will continue to push that at every opportunity.
Christine Jodin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fully appreciate what the Minister says about the engagement of the government standing up for international law. But with respect, it's been a year now, and every time we come here, we hear the same thing, and we hear that the situation has got worse. The entire region now is living in fear. The death toll is unimaginable. Have we not got to the point where we have to accept that continually saying this has to change is not enough? And we need to hear from the government what actions are actually going to be taken to convince both sides in this that we need a ceasefire, we need the humanitarian aid, and there are 97 hostages who have been in captivity for a year. We need more than just engagement and reminding of their plight. So what is the government going to do?
Minister.
Well, the new UK government has been absolutely clear that when it comes to international humanitarian law, the jurisdiction of both the ICC and the ICJ is absolutely paramount. It is legitimate. We've been absolutely explicit about that. We have repeatedly called for a ceasefire. We believe that bilateral engagement and multilateral engagement is very important. The UK should be seeking to exercise leadership towards de-escalation in this region. But on top of that, we of course have sought to fulfil our responsibilities when it comes to the provision of humanitarian aid that is so desperately needed by people there.
Joe Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been heartened to hear her, the Minister's call for a ceasefire both in Lebanon and in Gaza. Can she inform me and assure my constituents that we are evaluating and exhausting every available diplomatic effort to not only secure that ceasefire, but to get much-needed aid into those regions.
Minister.
Yes, I absolutely can, and the UK Government takes this responsibility incredibly seriously. We worked very hard to ensure that we were the first country which called for a ceasefire in relation to Lebanon within the G7. We worked very hard to encourage other countries to do the same, and of course we have consistently been calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza as well. That then must be followed, of course, by the surge of aid that's needed, but before that we need to make sure that there is no blockage of aid into Gaza, and also that people in Lebanon are adequately provided for as well. And I've been working very hard on that as Minister for Development.
Andrew George.
I strongly endorse the words of the Honourable Member for Middlesbrough, and I note that the Minister perpetually uses the word condemn when she refers to Israel's actions, and yet the Prime Minister last week came to this House and said that he stands with that far-right Israeli government. I mean, that is one of the most powerful and sophisticated military powers on this planet, and yet we only weeks ago used our military to help defend Israel. So where is the equivalence in terms of providing actual action to defend the people, the innocent people of Gaza and the people in Lebanon? It simply cannot carry on like this, and surely the government must stop pretending that it's bipartisan as far as this is concerned.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I must admit I found some of his comments rather difficult to understand. I think actually the Prime Minister could not have been clearer in stating that Israel has the right to defend itself. It absolutely does have that right. It's a democratic nation. It's important democratic nations have that right. But in addition, it of course is important that international humanitarian law is held to, and I believe this government has demonstrated our commitment to that principle in the actions that we've taken, including the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, myself and others in the government since our election.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last night, the Attorney-General, giving the 2024 Bingham Lecture, made a powerful case for the UK resuming its leading role in promoting international law after 14 years of backpedalling. Nowhere is that role more needed than in Gaza and Lebanon. So what further steps will the government take to stop the barbaric killing of civilians we see every day by Israeli forces operating in the occupied Palestinian territories and Lebanon with no pretense of following humanitarian law?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for those important points, and I had the privilege of hearing the Attorney-General restating the UK's commitment to international humanitarian law, also at an event commemorating the foundation of the Geneva Conventions. And I do think this is an important time for us to reflect upon their importance many decades after they were introduced, of course, out of the rubble of the Second World War. We do have that clear commitment. It must apply without fear or favour. This government has been determined to ensure that is the case, clearly in relation to Gaza and Lebanon, as we're talking about now, but also the many other instances where there's grave concern about humanitarian law being broken, including, for example, Sudan, Yemen, other contexts too.
Monica Harding.
The humanitarian crisis in the Middle East is another example of how the previous government's cuts to the aid budget has left us responding to crises like these with one hand tied behind our back. Since 2019, the ODA spending in Lebanon has fallen from over 200 million to just 7 million. Will the Secretary of State look at replenishing that fund?
Minister.
Well, I share the Honourable Lady's concern about the impacts the previous government's approach to financing overseas development. We, of course, also saw a very turbulent period where we saw in-donor refugee costs increasing, spiralling really out of control, and that eating up parts of the aid budget, which I've been very concerned indeed about. We're determined to deal with that situation in government. But when it comes to support for Lebanon, we're absolutely determined to do what we can with other countries countries with international organisations to support those in need. That led to, for example, the announcement of £5 million to UNICEF. That was an early announcement to make sure that we were pre-positioning the support that unfortunately has now become necessary. But in addition to that, we have announced £10 million to Lebanon to respond to the lack of shelter and reduced access to clean water, hygiene and healthcare.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I understand that the Minister is in a very difficult position, and I also understand that there's a huge amount of work that is going on behind the scenes to try and make progress in getting towards a ceasefire. However, I think the Minister, my right honourable friend, has heard the voices from across the House that current action just is not enough. The consistent, egregious breaches in international law by a supposed ally cannot be allowed to continue unfettered. We have to have a more detailed response from the UK with its other allies, as we did in relation to the breaches of international law against UNIFIL. Would the Minister commit to coming back to this House with a statement as far as she can go in terms of what the actions are going to be taken to send a clear message to Israel that is unacceptable behaviour?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the points that she made, and I don't think there will be anyone, whatever bench they are sitting on within the House, who is not deeply concerned about the situation impacting on people in Gaza, particularly in northern Gaza, but also now in Lebanon as well. And of course, we're now seeing this also impacting on people who had fled from Syria into Lebanon too. So this is a very dire situation. The UK government will do all that we can to de-escalate, to ensure the ceasefires that are so desperately needed. And of course, we would be more than happy to come back to the House to discuss these matters in UK government activity. We know how important those issues are to many of us and indeed many of our constituents.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for her answers to the question and for the confidence that she clearly shows. Does the Minister not agree that the presence of tunnels within the proximity of UN facilities are concerning, and is an indication that the prevalent mode in Gaza of underground facilities is being used in Lebanon, and is a clear indication of the scale of Hamas-Hezbollah terrorist reach? Minister, what is needed is to deal with this reach of terrorism rather than berating Israel, and should instead support Israel to eradicate all terrorism in that district.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question and for his kind words. The UK government is very clear that it is wrong to use civilians in that manner. It really is important that civilians are protected. We have seen appalling levels of civilians being killed. A number of colleagues have stated the figures already in this debate, and the UK government will do all that it can to de-escalate and to ensure the ceasefires that are needed.
John McDonald.
Why does the government allow to remain in our country Israeli diplomats that advocate a greater Israel, oppose a Palestinian state, and therefore the potential of a two-state solution, contrary to United Nations resolutions?
Well, I know that my honourable friend will be well aware that there are particular rules that apply to diplomatic representation. The UK government's position is that diplomacy is incredibly important, given the gravity of the situation impacting Gaza, also now Lebanon as well, and we will do all that we can through diplomatic means, including diplomatic representation of Israel, of other regional actors, to de-escalate and to secure the ceasefires that are needed.
Charlie Maynard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's very clear that many in this chamber believe that our government is not doing, an emphasis on doing, enough. Please will the Secretary of State acknowledge that sentiment? And given the disproportionate scale of killing, please will she apply consistency to our approach and commit to suspending all arms sales to Israel?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question, but I would appreciate, in the vein of constructive engagement, that any very clear suggestions for action are raised, rather than that kind of broad characterisation, which I don't believe actually does reflect the engagement of the new UK government, which has been intense since the first days of entering office to ensure that the UK is supplying the leadership that is needed here. Above all, to ensure that those who are so badly impacted by this dreadful situation are being supported in terms of aid, but also that we see the ceasefire that is so desperately needed. I have set out the fact that the UK has complied with our obligations, legal obligations, around assessing arms export licences. We took that responsibility very seriously indeed. We've debated it thoroughly in this House, and rightly so.
Thank
you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The author Howard Jacobson recently wrote that the sustained media coverage of children being killed in Gaza was functioning as a new blood libel against the British people. My right honourable friend will be aware of the horrendous role that blood libel has played in the violent programmes and horrendous anti-Semitism across history. Will my right honourable friend clearly state that the accurate reporting of the terrible deaths of thousands and thousands and thousands of children, and equally importantly, the humanising of those vibrant lives cut short by the actions of the Israeli Defence Force, that reporting is a critical part of the work of a free media in our country, so that our constituents can see the horrendous suffering which is happening in Gaza and Lebanon right now.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Accurate reporting is absolutely critical here, and we're seeing large numbers of images and footage circulating that is incredibly disturbing. For perhaps one of the first times, we're seeing our constituents able to access this wherever they are, because they can see it on their smartphone, not just on television screens. And it really is important that we have accuracy there, both, of course, so that there's clarity about what has taken place for our domestic population, but also so that, for example, assessments around humanitarian law can be taken in a fully informed manner. That is how they must be taken legally. Thank you.
Claire Hannah.
UN peacekeepers, including 380 Irish soldiers, are currently being intimidated and threatened by the IDF with armaments pointing directly at Irish troops who have protected innocent Lebanese civilians against Hezbollah and the IDF for decades. The IDF have repeatedly violated international law, including around armed conflict, and treat hospitals, schools, churches and tents as legitimate targets. I know that the Minister agrees that the UN peacekeeper mandate must be upheld. If Israel continue on their current path, when will the UK use the arms, trade and official sanctions at their disposal?
Minister.
My honourable friend rightly pointed out the critical role of peacekeepers, and we do recognise that includes Irish nationals as well as nationals from a number of countries. And we are very clear, and I'm grateful to her for underlining this, we are very clear that UNIFIL's role in southern Lebanon is crucial. It has a clear mandate from UN Security Council Resolution 1701. We will continue to support that mandate, and I'm grateful to her for underlining that.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today in the gallery we are joined by my friends from the excellent health and human rights NGO Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and we pay tribute to their brave work. Together with other Israeli human rights organisations, today they have warned that the international community must act now to stop Israel from forcibly transferring the population of northern Gaza. The government must do more. What concrete new action is the government taking to stop this from happening?
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I'm grateful to all of those who are engaged in promoting the health of those in Gaza, which is under so much pressure at the moment, and the UK government is very concerned in particular about the potential for communicable disease, especially with winter approaching. So I want to pay tribute to all those working in this area. And the UK government has been very clear here. We already see over 85% of Gaza now under evacuation orders. That's causing chronic overcrowding. People are desperately seeking shelter. The situation in northern Gaza is appalling, frankly, at the moment, and we will continue to raise our concern around this with all of the parties regionally, internationally and multilaterally also.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the fact that the Minister has repeated the government's support for a two-state solution and for an independent Palestinian state. Simple question to the Minister: when? What more do the Palestinian people have to do to convince the government to follow in the steps of other European governments and give immediate recognition to that state?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this important issue. The UK government is crystal clear here. Palestinian statehood is the right of the Palestinian people, as I said a few moments ago in this chamber. It is not in the gift of any neighbour, and it's also essential to the long-term security of Israel. He asked about timing. The government has been very clear. We will recognise a Palestinian state as a contribution to a peace process at a time that's most conducive to the long-term prospects for peace, and surely peace is what we all need to see.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This morning we heard that Lord Cameron had done all the preparatory work to sanction 2 members of the Israeli government. Could my honourable friend say what she has done with that work over 3 months that it has been in the department, and also if the government has commenced looking at work to sanction the Israeli Prime Minister for his contribution to these war crimes?
Minister.
So my honourable friend quite rightly raised the issue of sanctions. I referred previously in this debate to the fact that the UK government has sanctioned those who have been promoting illegal and violent actions by settlers. We've been very clear about the unacceptable nature of that. Of course, we will always keep our sanctions regime under review, and we take that responsibility very seriously.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Minister agree that securing an urgent ceasefire is a vital first step to securing a lasting peace in the region?
Absolutely, and the UK government will continue to advocate very strongly indeed for that, both in relation to Gaza and in relation to Lebanon.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will the Minister join me in condemning IDF attacks on UNIFIL in Lebanon? And could she outline further what action the government is taking to improve the safety and security of the personnel and premises of the UNIFIL UN peacekeeping mission, particularly in light of recent comments from Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Minister.
I absolutely will join my honourable friend in condemning any inappropriate attacks on UN agencies of any type. I was clear a few moments ago about the UK government's commitment to UNIFIL. We believe that their role in southern Lebanon is crucial. We were appalled to hear that UN peacekeepers had been injured by Israeli fire, and alongside international allies and partners, we have very clearly condemned attacks on UN peacekeepers.
Tahir Ali.
Deputy Speaker, yesterday the General Secretary for United Nations condemned Israel for once again targeting civilians. The Minister stated Israel must comply with international humanitarian law. We have been hearing that for over a year in this chamber now. What action will this government take in terms of stopping Israel abusing human rights and committing war crimes?
Minister.
So, honourable friend rightly mentioned the UN's role within this. We have been, as a new government, ensuring that we play that leadership role, including in relation to the UN. When I was at the UN General Assembly, I discussed these matters in detail, particularly the mandate of UNRWA, the importance for rejecting attacks on UNRWA's mandate. And he asked about action. I believe that I've already set that out, but I would just underline that very speedily. The UK government is very clear about the jurisdiction of the ICC, of the ICJ, and we have conducted that review of arms export licences that was needed legally, and we're determined to fulfil our legal responsibilities. Thank you.
Final question, Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Reports describing the complete dismantlement of Gaza's healthcare infrastructure are impossible to ignore when the World Health Organization has reported over 1,000 health attacks and reports of nearly 1,000 health workers dying so far in this conflict. What will the government do to protect health workers as this conflict escalates? And will they consider sanctions in relation to these flagrant violations of international law?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for mentioning that situation of healthcare workers, and of course I referred to this a few moments ago with those present in this chamber who have helped to deliver much needed healthcare. The UK government is absolutely clear: healthcare workers must be protected. We see a very disturbing situation around healthcare currently in Gaza. In particular, we see water and sanitation in a precarious situation across much of Gaza. The winter is approaching, and therefore we do need to ensure that people are protected there. The UK government will do all we can around that, and I know there were many who wished to ask other questions. I would just say, Madam Deputy Speaker, if any of them wish to write to me, I'd be very happy to respond, or indeed Minister Falconer will. Thank you.